Okay, we just finished up number 4, JSON. Let's move on to number 5, Einstein Web Service. I'll show you a better way how to set up the web service. And this Einstein Web Service example is almost the exact same as the challenge, except for the challenge, the data may be different. So let's first look up the quote service. Okay, so this is a little bit different than what the previous example was because we have different actions. So this is my API. If I want to get a quote, I need to send, you'll see the question mark here, so that's a GET request. I need to send a key called action, and I need to send GET quote as the string. Now if I do that, okay, if I send GET quote, you'll scroll down here, you'll see GET quote. If I don't put a number there, it's going to default to the first one. So you see Einstein quotes is an array. I'm going to get back the first index. Now if I do GET quote and I send a number, let's say from 0 to the maximum, okay, you'll see I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 quotes. So if I send a number from 0 to the maximum, then I'm going to get that. So if they send back, let's say 1, I'll get the second quote, 2, third quote, and so on. Now if number is not there, I'll just default to the first one. If number's there, so if it's not empty, then I'll actually get the value. So if the number's empty, I'll return 0. Otherwise, I'll actually get the number and then put that into my array. Okay, so that's what's going to happen on the challenge 2. Now if they send back the action which equals to count quotes, it will come here to the switch and it's going to count how many Einstein quotes we have, which will return back our maximum value. I also have the option to do a get random quote. If they send action equal to get random, it'll come to here and it will grab a random quote, and then if they send something besides those, I'll send them back. Okay, you need to send get quote, count quotes, or get random. And if it was successful, it's going to send back that data. So whatever the info is, which is probably going to be a quote or the error message, it's going to send that back using print. Okay, so this is what the challenge is doing. Now, with the challenge, you don't need to create this PHP code. I've created the PHP code. It's on my server. You need to send an AJAX request to my server. So don't worry about the PHP code. Just look at the documentation for the API that I've sent to you in the challenge documentation and send the appropriate request to my server so we can see how to do that. Now I'd like to come back to index.html. So open up index.html, and this is similar to what you guys will need to do, except you may have many function calls. So with this one, instead of having many function calls, which a lot of students do for the challenge, you can have one function call and change up the options because it's going to be going to the same server. For the challenge, you want to write as least amount of code as possible. And for any challenge, let's say you're in the industry, you don't want to have 10 function calls and they all have duplicate code. You can actually write one function call and change up the options. So let's see. When they click on the button, this function will get called. You'll see I'm using jQuery. I'm going to set up my GET request. I'm going to set up my GET request. It's going to go to our quote service. Okay, with mine, I call it web service on the challenge. And I'm going to send up data. So I'm going to have an options here. It's going to be a dynamic variable. And when the data returns, when the AJAX request turns, it's going to call this anonymous function. Now I usually set it up in one line like this, and then I separate the function into multiple lines. So when the function gets called, I'm basically going to update the UI. So I'm going to call the content box, capital B, change the inner HTML to whatever data the server sends back. Now right now we're calling get quote. So instead of writing this GET request, let's say for the challenge, I think you have to do it 4 or 5 times. Instead of writing this GET request 4 or 5 times, you can have one GET request, and every time they click on the button, you just change this options. So the first time we're going to do get quote. So let's see this run. So I'll update the code on the server. I'll come back here. I'll call Einstein Web Service. I'll call get content. So you'll see it grabs the first quote because I didn't specify the num. So if I want to specify the num, I can change the options. Okay. Instead of just action, so we'll also include action. We always have to include the action. We'll do get quote for the action. But this time we're also going to send up a num. So let's say I want to get the third quote. Okay, now that's index tree, so it'll actually be the fourth quote. Now this is a JavaScript object, and the last one doesn't need a comma. So you have key value pair, comma, key value pair. Last key value pair does not have a quote. So now I'm changing the option. So let's say I had 4 different buttons. Instead of writing this 4 times, depending on which function they call, which button they click, I could just change up my options. I don't need to write this GET request several times. So I've overridden the options. So I'll come back. Okay, I'll run it. I'll go back here, refresh the page, click on GET, and you'll see it's a different quote. Okay, so if I change this, let's say to 2, upload the server, refresh the page. Okay, you'll see it's a different quote. Now, let's say I want to do a different action. Okay, I can change my options up again. Let's say instead of action equal get quote, I can try the other part of the API. Maybe I do a count quotes, okay, which was an option. Okay, count quotes. Okay, make sure you follow the API documentation. So whatever it's looking for, it needs to be case sensitive the same. So if I do get quotes and I don't spell it correctly, it's not going to do it properly. If I do count quotes and misspell it or have some case sensitive characters not the same, it's not going to work. So I override the options. So let's say I clicked on a different button, I change the options and use the same GET request. Okay, so I'll run this here and you'll see I have 5 quotes. The last option that I have is to get a random quote. I can say action is equal to this, and I can do get random. Okay, that's the last key value pair, so I don't need a comma. And if I put a comma there, I'll get an error. So now I'm going to get a random quote. So I refresh, I'll get content. There's quote 1, different quote, different quote, different quote, different quote, different quote. So I'm getting a random quote each time. So this is what I recommend doing. Now I've written a quote service, so you don't need to write this. I've written the web service for the challenge. It's going to look like this. I give you the API documentation. I tell you what actions you can do and how you need to implement them. These are case sensitive. Okay, the key is case sensitive and the value is case sensitive. Depending on what action you give my web service, I'll give you back what you're asking for. So it's just like a real API that you'd see in the industry, except this one's smaller, but that's okay. The concept's there. So action is spelled correctly, get random spelled correctly, that'll work perfectly fine. So for the challenge, you need to do these different actions. Now you can write, 4 or 5 different GET requests and hard code those actions here, or you can write one GET request because basically they're all the same, and you can dynamically change the content. You can dynamically change the options. You can dynamically change the options based off which function they choose. Okay, instead of writing the same code multiple times, just change the options. It'll make your code a lot simpler, a lot cleaner, and you'll have a lot less bugs to sort through. Later, if you need to update the code, it'll also be easier to maintain this code as well. So be careful with the challenge. Try to write the code in the least amount of lines as possible. Try to minimize the code. Try not to have duplicate code. Try to use the best programming practices that you can do to complete that challenge. This is a perfect example of what the challenge will be, except instead of sending it to your quote service, you're going to send it to mine. So if you copy that link from the document and paste it here, it's going to go to my server, make a request from my web service. My web service will return back to your front end, and then you should update your front end just like we're doing here. Okay, and for the challenge, you don't need to write the PHP code, just write the front end code. Now the front end code could be ran on your local machine to test, but make sure you upload it to the server when you submit the code. Make sure you submit a link and the HTML file. Now when you submit the code, you cannot submit a link and a zip file at the same time. So first submit the link, then go back and resubmit and click upload URL. You'll paste the URL into Canvas and you'll upload the URL. So it's actually a separate submission type. Okay, that's all we got for today. Good luck on the challenge, and we'll see you next time.